Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I've eaten a lot of crow in my time, and I might be ordering a steaming pile after this video depending on what goes down. Last time I made a video about how I thought it was impossible to adapt something or make it good was when I preemptively predicted that the Twisted Metal TV show was gonna be crap. And in my defense, I had every reason to believe that, between the terrible promotional material as well as the fact that they were trying to adapt something that never had any clear-cut overarching story led me to believe that it was going to be terrible. But then it turns out they just decided to take specific elements from the games while being somewhat its own thing. Then they made the correct assumption that something like that could never work if it took itself too seriously, at least as a long-form content, and just decided to make it dumb schlocky fun. This time, on the other hand, I'm pretty confident in saying that I don't think a God of War TV show can work, at least the one that's currently being made. Based on the current things we know at this point, it's not looking good. I'm always happy to be proven wrong in these circumstances, but I'm very much skeptical, and unlike previous instances of me being skeptical of something, it's not a gut feeling, it's not based on any sort of pattern, nor is it based on anything we've yet seen. For me right now, my belief that the God of War TV show can't work is entirely down to the red flags that we've seen. And there is a mountain of red flags collecting right now as far as this TV show is concerned. Now, do I think a God of War TV show is an inherently bad idea? Believe it or not, I don't, because a story worth telling transcends medium, and as a self-professed God of War fanboy, I would love to have this story be something that everyone can experience. I said this in the past, but it's worth reiterating. We live in a gaming bubble on YouTube here, so it's easy to forget that not everyone has interest in playing games. And not everyone has the skill to play games. Some people have never and will never pick up a controller. So even telling people to play through the games on Give Me Story difficulty isn't enough in some cases, especially because that still requires you to pay hundreds of dollars for the equipment to play the game when the average streaming service is something like, what, 15 bucks? A friend of mine was telling me about how his roommate was playing a game, I won't say which, but it was a platformer game that practically plays itself, and yet he still struggled to get past the first 3 levels. Why? Because his roommate never played games and never had any interest. Sometimes it just be like that, and that's why video game adaptations exist, for people like that who may be interested but aren't equipped to experience it. That said, it's a bad sign when one of the people who aren't equipped to experience the game is the showrunner of the show, Ronald D. Moore. Yeah, it's come out recently that the showrunner is so catastrophically bad at video games, he can't play these games even on the lowest difficulty. Now, let me be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that on an objective level. Like I said, some people just don't play games. Some people don't have that lifetime of experience that allows you to intrinsically understand the mechanics of modern video games and especially modern controllers. And to be quite frank, he probably has better things to do. The problem here is, if he doesn't have the specific understanding to properly immerse himself in the experience of God of War, why is he the showrunner? To those of you who don't know, the showrunner is the crew member in a TV production who essentially runs the day-to-day operations of the project. They oversee the whole thing creatively. You may be mistaken in thinking that that would be the director, but in television, every episode can have a different director. The showrunner is almost like the director's director. But they can also direct episodes, but it's not necessarily the same thing. But if you admit in no uncertain terms that you haven't experienced the series because you lack the physical capabilities of doing so, that says to me that it will be much harder for you to create an accurate adaptation because to understand the experience, you need to, experience it. Forgive the technical lingo. But also the fact that he hasn't played it is an indication that he's not a fan of the source material, which speaks poorly to the potential of an adaptation. Sure, he can just watch a cutscene compilation to understand the story, but for one thing, he's still basically broadcasted to the world that he's not a fan, and 2, he's gone on about how he hasn't played the games and has made no indication that he's going out of his way to experience the story in any other way. It would probably be something important to mention if he has. Hey, I haven't played the games, but I've watched the cutscenes and it's a great story. Here's the thing, let's take Craig Mazin for example. He was a big fan of The Last of Us. He sought out a TV adaptation. He had a passion for the series that drove the TV show. Now, if you're one of those people who gets violently angry at anything positive being spoken about The Last of Us whatsoever, I don't want to hear it. That's why I turned off comments for that video. One look at my spam folder was enough for me to tap out. But objectively speaking, the show reviewed well and was watched by, I believe, 12 million people at its peak? It was, for all intents and purposes, a universal success. And that all stemmed from the fact that Craig Mazin was a fan and wanted to do the game justice. If you have somebody producing the show who's not a fan and doesn't really have the base level of experience that comes with having played the games to begin with, that can't speak well for the show's chances going forward. You see, God of War fans expect a very specific set of things in these stories, largely because the story is such a major focus in the series. It's not a broad world where you can more or less tell your own story within a larger continuity, nor is it something that doesn't really have a set canon and you can largely do your own thing without disrespecting the characters. This is an adaptation of a well-known story that has a hard and fast sequence of events that you need to adapt well, otherwise it's disrespectful to the source material, and you can't disrespect that without pissing off a lot of people, myself included. And there's no way they're going in that direction based on what little we know at this point, especially because they're starting at the wrong point. Now, I'm not sure if this is still the case ever since the first version of the show got scrapped. You see, apparently production got restarted at some point. There's some news stories to indicate that this is still the case, but I'm not sure if it's been confirmed or if we're just running off the same reports from when the first version of the show got announced. But early reports stated that the show is going to be an adaptation of the Norse Games, and I'm like, no, 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 no. Look, I get it. The Norse games are easier to adapt because there are more characters and more character interactions, and therefore it's easier to tell a more traditional story without the gameplay elements, but the problem with that is, and this shouldn't take a genius to know, you can't tell the Norse story without the Greek story. Because without that story being told, you have absolutely no context for who Kratos is or what the f*** is going on. So the story will automatically lose a lot of its weight, but the problem is, you also can't tell the story of the Greek games without the interactability, at least not seamlessly. Because that story is largely a solo adventure with very little dialogue or character interaction. But a game can tell a story that's largely spread out and connected with significant segments of gameplay, because that's the advantage of a game. Large segments of gameplay are expected, so you don't need an episode's worth of dialogue every 20 minutes. And also, a game can easily tell different types of stories where interactability is required, largely by using the environment, something that God of War does. It doesn't work without the interactive elements, so it's a bit of a catch-22. You need to tell the Greek story, but you can't tell it without heavy alterations. And it's also not the type of thing that can simply be hand-waved away with a couple of flashbacks because it's an extremely important story. Yeah, you could probably get away with outright ignoring the prequel games outside of Deimos, but for the story to carry any of its emotional weight, you need to at least tell the story of the main trilogy. Like, yeah, the story will probably carry emotional weight for the fans, but the fans already know the story. Realistically, what an adaptation should be is, first of all, for the fans, an accurate and respectful retelling of the story that they're familiar with enough alterations that the story can still take them by surprise. And for non-fans, something that properly tells the story in such a way that they can get fully invested in the world and the characters in the same way that the people who played the games have. I think a great example of this would be something like... not a game, but an adaptation nonetheless. Recently I've been binge watching the series, and I think from what I can tell, it absolutely nails exactly what it needs to nail for both audiences. Because it's a compelling story in itself so that the people who have never read the comic series can get into it, but then for the people who have read it, they make enough alterations that even hardcore fans can get something new out of it. Like how in the Season 3 finale, it's established that Conquest is lonely and is a victim of his own success because other Viltrumites are scared of him. This, from what I understand, wasn't an aspect of his character in the comics. Apparently, he was more of a generic force of nature without much character. But they took the opportunity to improve on the source material where they could. But if you simultaneously disrespect the source material by, for example, starting halfway through and then make a story that doesn't provide the same emotional weight and catharsis that the games do for the people who have never experienced this story, you're essentially making a show for nobody. I mean, I suppose that if you structured it correctly, you could have dedicated flashback episodes during important parts. Like, for example, during the part of the story where Atreus falls ill, I imagine they might be able to have a flashback episode during that part. While Kratos is riding down the river, they do that bit where we see Athena in her spectral form. Then we can do a match shot crossfade of the statue of Athena from the first game, and then they tell you the story from the first game to the end of the third game, and then we cut back to him digging up the Blades of Chaos. That might work, but then that would be what, 4 or 5 episodes of like 8 or 9? So you're really expecting the audience to drudge through a lot of story not knowing who Kratos is or what his backstory is, on the assumption that the audience will stick around to get to that point. Assuming that's how they do it, and maybe that's not how they do it, maybe there is some obvious structuring to where they can succinctly and meaningfully summarize the different important aspects of Kratos' previous life that's gracefully presented in such a way to tie into the telling of the Norse Games and not have one overshadow the other. Maybe they can have a dedicated segment in every episode that tells a piece of the backstory in accordance to the relevant themes of that episode. I don't know. Like I said, there's probably a way to do it. Then again, I believe there was probably a way for them to have told the Greek saga games in a television format. And instead, they decided to skip to the modern games. So even if they aren't intentionally disrespecting the vast majority of the series, it comes across as a tacit disrespect just for the fact that they aren't doing it. Because let's be honest, what I really don't like about them starting on the Norse games is that it's a tacit admission that the Norse games are more important than the Greek games. Which even and especially as someone who likes both pretty much equally, that does not sit right with me. Because it's simultaneously a tacit implication that the old games really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. There's a cynical part of me that believes that Hollywood has bought into the same bullshit that a lot of games journalists have bought into and continue to buy into, that the old school God of War is automatically lowbrow and less worthy as pieces of art just because they dare have extreme violence and nudity, which once again, as I always say, is an extremely ignorant thing to say when it's a series that actually has a lot of hidden depth if you're willing to actually put your thinking cap on and examine it critically instead of just giving surface level examinations based on incredibly prudish ideas of what can and can't be considered good storytelling. And it is prudish. The idea that certain things can simply be written off based on incredibly surface level aspects of the presentation. I'm not saying that this is necessarily 100% the case, but they haven't done anything to prove to me that it's not the case. And here's the thing, tacit disrespect of the Greek saga aside, there are some other issues that this sort of adaptation runs into inherently. Most notably the fact that I don't think it's possible to do justice to Kratos in live action. You would need an actor who is at least something like 6'6", bald, built like a brick house, and is a good dramatic actor. But more than anything, you would need someone who doesn't look goofy in white makeup. And I don't think there exists an actor in the entire world who wouldn't look uncanny and straight up goofy in full white makeup. Then there's also the voice.
You aided my son in disobeying me.
No, Kratos has always had a very distinctive voice, and unless you're willing to overdub him with Christopher Judge ADR, that would be a very difficult thing to cast, but how else do you do it? Of course, some fans have discussed the idea of casting Christopher Judge as the live-action Kratos, and respect to the man, I just don't think that would work. Obviously he motion captured for the guy, so he has the build, although he might have slimmed down a bit, he is in his 60s now. But with all the respect in the world, Christopher Judge could do the physical acting without needing to look like Kratos when he was motion capturing, because they can just throw a character model over his motion capture. But if you were to deck Christopher Judge out in full white makeup, I don't think that would look anything other than ridiculous. Now, if they were to ADR his voice into somebody else's performance, I'd be fine with that. As far as authentically capturing what the modern games are going for, that's about the only way to do it. Beyond that, I think the only way you could potentially accurately portray Kratos physically is probably good prosthetics. I mean, hey, I saw The Penguin, and the highlight of me for that show was seeing how they made Colin Farrell go from this to this. So it's possible, but even then I have my reservations about whether or not a full 100% real live-action Kratos could work visually. I mean, look at this Super Bowl ad for God of War Ascension. Does this not look uncanny?
What the hell is that?
Even though the modern God of War games look almost real, there's still a level of unreality to them that makes this work. And I suppose that comes down to the fact that these characters can look however we want, and they can refine it until it works. Meanwhile, if you're attempting to make a CGI character look not goofy in live action, I don't know, you're facing a really uphill battle. And I know what you're all thinking. What about Dave Bautista? He's part Greek, he's tall, he's muscular, and he's a good actor. And I would say, yes, he's probably the best option we have available to us right now, at least on a mainstream basis. But one, I'd imagine he demands quite a price tag these days, and two, I still think he would look absolutely ridiculous in the white makeup. So basically, those are my 3 red flags I've noticed so far. Now, do I believe the show is destined to suck? I think it's destined to be a disappointment. I don't necessarily believe it'll straight up suck. I don't believe that Amazon would put this much money into a project only to have it come out poorly. If this were Netflix, sure, but when it comes to Amazon original shows, from what I can tell, they're usually no worse than mediocre. Plus, they pump tons of money into these things, so if nothing else, we can expect something that looks pretty cool. But even still, this TV show is fighting an uphill battle, and I think this is a series that deserves better than that. And while I'm not necessarily sure about the first 2 issues I had, I feel like there was an easy way to circumvent any potential issues that could have come up from the presentation. But to establish that solution, I first have to ask a question, even if it physically pains me to say that. Why live action? I mean, I know why live action just has a broader appeal. But the thing is, certain things work better for live action than they do for animation, but some things just work better as animation. As you guys know, I went out of my way to watch the first season of the Percy Jackson TV show and quite enjoyed it. But if you go into any place that you can discuss that series, be it Reddit or whatever, it's like every second comment is about how the series should have been animated. It's to the point that I'm sick of hearing about it. Yes, I get it, it should have been animated, but it isn't, so get over it. That's why I feel like a bit of a hypocrite even bringing this up. But also, there's nothing about Percy Jackson or The Last of Us or Fallout or whatever that doesn't work in live action if done well. So I feel like doing them as animated TV shows would instead be deliberately limiting the audience. This though, I just don't believe that live action was the way to go. I feel like they're limiting themselves and potentially leaving the show open to having subpar presentation because it's one of those things that's larger than life, and so you sort of need a layer of unreality put over it to make it believable. Because you throw the unreality of it into sharper relief by trying to make it too real. So I don't know. But in the end, I could be making a fool out of myself if the show ends up being good, and it could still end up being good, but I'm more confident than I usually am in saying that I don't think it will be. It has too much working against it, and I think at best it might end up being a painfully forgettable pile of tripe, with a really weird looking main character. But that's all I've got, so if you like this video, be sure to leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want a more direct means of supporting the channel, you can donate to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Hydra Overlord, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Sphinx, Weird Webster, Will Stokes, and Gaw004 for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.